So, before we get into the issue of Nestorius and Nestorianism, there are a couple things that we need to revisit as a reminder, because it sets the background for why all of this becomes an issue. Some of the things that we need to keep in mind is, number one, we've already spoken about men coming to these theological questions without anything previously to inform them, so they're cutting new ground, and it would behoove us to be charitable when able. We've talked about this with Origen and some of the other individuals that have come across our path. The strange situation that we find when we look at these particular challenges, that each and every one of these individuals, regardless of whether it was Sabellius, Arius, Apollinarius, it doesn't matter. All of these guys were absolutely convinced that they were defending the truth of Christianity. It wasn't as if they stood up and they said, oh no, I'm going to go start my own thing, and therefore I'm going to disagree with you. No, they thought they were defending the faith. They truly believed that. So when we come across some of these people, and we'll see that with Nestorius, when we come across these people, it behooves us to step out of our 20th century mindset and place ourselves in their context. I had a history professor when I was doing my undergraduate work in classics, and he used to say, leave your 20th century baggage at the door when you step in this classroom, because how we evaluate these things today is literally based upon what they discovered back then. They provided the seedbed of information to which we have the ability today to make these assessments on history and morals and politics and all of these things. But they didn't have that advantage. They were doing this from nothing. We call it de novo. It was just blank. So we can be critical and we can be precise, but it's important that we also extend a little bit of charity. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is that there were political issues that were going on. And we've already seen this. We've already seen the issues with the secular versus the religious, the East versus the West. Tensions are already, right now when we get to Ephesus, we're in the 5th century, but we're already seeing the tension between the East and the West. And it started way back. I mean, we saw some of that with Nicaea. And it just keeps building and building. And I've used the illustration to the point of being annoying, but it's that artillery round that you fire. If you're just a little bit off at the beginning, by the time you get downrange 16 miles, you're miles and miles and miles apart. Well, this is what's happening already within the church. The church is already starting to divide. They're already starting to place their stakes in the ground and defend their positions. And one of the expressions of that division comes right here. The difference between the Antiochian school and the Alexandrian school. Now, we've already seen this. We've already talked about this. We haven't talked specifically about it in the manner in which I'm going to discuss this morning. But we have already addressed this, because we've already talked about Origen from the Alexandrian school. We've already talked about some clown named, there's so much for my Christian charity, some gentleman named Paul of Samosata. Okay, we've alluded to him, because Paul of Samosata was the man that taught Arius. And it was Arius that brought his issue to bear on Nicaea. So not only do we have this, I don't say novelty, not only do we have this initiation of thought that does not have the ability to fall back on something, at least in the earliest stages. Nestorius presents a slightly different problem because where Origen and some of the men in the early 2nd and 3rd century had nothing, Nestorius had some of the fathers on which he could rest. So he presents a little different issue. But the point still being, we've got multiple different issues taking place in the early church. And these are very complicated. We've got the religious, we've got the regional arguments, we've got East versus West, then we get the political. And when we finally get into Nestorius, I'm hoping to get at least to the beginning this morning, and then next week we'll really hit him hard. We'll discuss him thoroughly. You're going to see that all of this comes crashing down. But when we talk about these two schools, it's important to keep this in mind because at this stage in the church, these two schools, for all intents and purposes, represent the positions that men will bring to bear when they look at Scripture, when they look at these theological issues. And it's not as complicated as you may think. The Antiochian school, okay, essentially northern Turkey for the most part, but the Antiochian school, no, let me do the Alexandrian first. The Alexandrian school emphasized an allegorical interpretation of Scripture. And they tended toward a Christology that emphasized the union of the human and the divine, which was different from the Antiochian. Now, I can't remember who it was. I believe it was Origen. But the manner in which the allegorical interpretation of Scripture manifests itself is something along these lines, okay? We have the four Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you have to look at the four Gospels as though it was a table. And the table presents the Gospel, and each leg of the Gospel on the table is one of the apostles. And this is the way they allegorize Scripture. And then from there they develop this theology about what the table stands for, and the gospel the gospel being the top of the table, resting on the legs of the four apostles, and they create this whole big fanciful thing. Let me see if I can think of another one that's a bit better, but well, if I come up with something next week, I'll let you know. But the point is that they don't look at what they're reading as if that is the literal meaning of the text. They build on it and build on it. Whereas, and this is Origen, this is Cyril of Alexandria, this is Athanasius, this is all of these gentlemen. They come from the Alexandrian school. And the irony is, with the Alexandrian school, defending orthodoxy to the nth degree that they did, even they have serious theological issues. I mean, allegorical interpretation being one of them, but we've seen that Gregory of Nyssa was a universalist. Everybody saved. So, and there are other problems. Cyril, who we will talk about as a foil to Nestorius. Cyril believed in Miaphysitism, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's a problem. On the other hand, we have the Antiochian school, which, when they look at Scripture, they were primarily interpreting Scripture in a literal, and at times a typological manner of exegesis. And their Christology emphasized the distinction. Now, if there's any two terms that you should keep in a margin or underlined or in quotations or however you take notes, the terms that you need to keep in mind are union for the Alexandrian school and the distinction for the Antiochian school. Because, as I said, when we start to move down the corridors of history, not only do these two schools part ways with each other, the meaning of those terms part ways within their own schools. And what distinction means for the Alexandrian school becomes very problematic, and what union means for the, what distinction means for the Antiochian school becomes very problematic, and what union means for the Alexandrian school becomes very problematic. And we will see that very soon. So, I've already given you some of the advocates for the Alexandrian school, and to be honest, I'm not going to name the whole list of guys for the Antiochian because we haven't encountered them, and it would just confuse you. But the one you do need to keep in mind is Paul of Samosata, because he was directly connected to Arius, and those are the two names you need to keep in mind with the Antiochian school. And if you just think about Arius, and you think about distinction, you see why distinction becomes so critical in our discussion of the nature of Christ and of Christology. We talked a little bit, let's see, another difference, and we won't spend too much time on it, but another difference between the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school is the Antiochian school actually went through three phases. It went through an early phase, a middle phase, and then the final phase. And the early phase ran up until about the 5th century, the 400s, 433 to be exact. And an interesting advocate was St. John Chrysostom. The primary person in the earliest stage was Theophilus of Antioch. The middle, and again, there's a whole bunch of guys. Theodore of Heraclea was another one, Heraclean Turkey. But those are the main ones. The middle period is from 430 to the Council of Ephesus. Well, actually, a little later than that. Oh, I'm sorry. Back up. The early school is 170 to the 4th century to the 300s. The middle school is 350 to 433, and then the later school is anything after 433. So, the middle school was only around for 80 years. But that was the period where they brought forth men like John Chrysostom and one of the most famous names in ancient church history, Theodore of Mopsuestia, Mopsuestia. And he, in other contexts, is a very, very important figure because he was how do I want to put this politely? Let's just say he and St. Jerome did not get along. And when you start looking at some of the arguments that are presented against episcopacy, where they invoke the name of St. Jerome, Theodore of Mopsuestia provides a very powerful rebuttal to some of the arguments from St. Jerome. And if you're interested in that, it's in my book. Not that I'm hawking a book. And then, of course, there's the late period, and that's everything after Ephesus. And the most the most significant individuals there, well, I'll just name one, Basil of Seleucia, Seleucia. But I mention this because it's important to understand that everything that we do, theologically, historically, politically, doesn't really matter, everything we do is built on somebody else. I mean, we're in the 21st century. The problem that the 21st century has is that it always thinks it can reinvent the wheel. It never goes back to look at any of the preceding issues that the church, I'll just use the church, that the church had to address. Because if they did, we wouldn't have a lot of the issues that we have today. We still have some, because you get guys like Bill Craig that think that they can reinvent the wheel. Well, I like Apollinarianism, so I'm going to be a neo-Apollinarian. Yeah, good. Okay, you can be a new heretic if you want. All right, so I'm going to define some terms for you, because these terms become very important as we're discussing Nestorius, and as we move forward. And you will see why it becomes such an issue with Nestorius when you understand what these terms mean. I'll start with the easy ones. Theotokos means God-bearer. Christotokos means Christ-bearer. Okay. This is the issue. The question of Mary's relationship to Christ at his birth is the driving point that creates the Nestorian controversy. Everybody thinks Nestorius starts with this Nestorian division, and then of course this pops in. This was the issue that started it. He had a problem with the phrase Theotokos, but we will get into that. Okay, so those are the two primary terms. This issue created this mess. Okay? Now, this is Miaphysitism. Okay? One nature. This is Deiphysitism. Two natures. Okay? And this is Monophysitism, which technically means one nature, but it doesn't mean the same thing that Miaphysitism means. Yeah, don't worry, I'll explain it. All right. When we talk about Miaphysitism, when we talk about that, what we are talking about is the recognition, and this is Cyril of Alexandria that believes this, and this is where the first problem arises with Cyril. We're talking about the recognition of the divinity and the humanity of Christ, okay? So we have the two natures. We recognize these two natures. But Monophysitism unites the two natures into one nature. Now, notice the phrase. What did I say? What was the most important word out of the Alexandrian school? Union. So, Cyril unites the two natures into one nature. Okay? Think of, it's a really crass illustration, but think of two boards, one pine, one oak, boom. They're made one object, okay? Two distinct, but one object. So far, so good? Yeah. All right. Deiphysitism is obviously the exact opposite. We have two natures. Distinct, separate, two. Okay? United, but not united to the degree of Miaphysitism, and I'll show you why in a second. Okay, so we've got this really tight union and this distinction. Then there's Monophysitism, or what was known as Eutychianism. And you don't have to know that, but it does come into play later. Monophysitism is one nature, but it is not one nature united as in miaphysitism. It's one nature conflated. You take chocolate syrup and you put it in with strawberry syrup and you mix them together and you got goop, right? You got one bleh. That's what monophysitism is. You take the divine nature of Christ and you take the human nature of Christ and you merge them so that there's this composite hybrid of something. Okay, I'm getting a scrunchy face. Why the scrunchy face?
Go ahead.
Do you see the distinction at least? All right?
I don't see the distinction between monophysitism and miaphysitism based on what you just described.
Why not?
Why not? Because you're saying miaphysitism is two natures, divine and human, united into one resulting nature.
One nature with recognizing that it is both divine and human. This
Right.
does not recognize that. This
Okay.
This monophysitism merges them such that there's a melding of the human and the divine, but it is only there's only the divine that takes precedent. But they do recognize that there were two natures that were unified.
Okay.
But then that would be a whole different God than what the Trinity started out with.
No, the way
You're getting way.
the way I see it is the chocolate and the strawberry are muddled in monophysitism. But in miaphysitism, you have the two natures, they are together, but they're not muddled.
Right.
They're both very clear,
Yeah.
but they're together.
Yeah. Here, I've got two pens. This is a pencil, mechanical pencil, and this is a mechanical pen. I put these together and I create one writing object. But they're still two different objects. Now if I melted these down and created one indistinct object, that's monophysitism. That's what that is. Okay? And we will see shortly why that is such a significant problem. But these in and of themselves are problematic. So, we see these two, diaphysitism recognizes not only the two natures, the divine nature and the human nature, it recognizes them as joined in one person, but still identifiable as true, distinct natures.
Can I follow that by thinking I am fully my father's child, I'm also fully my mother's child, but I'm a distinct from both?
Be honest, Diane, any analogy that we come up with is a challenge, it's a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, it's close, but that's not exactly what we're talking about. But before we move on, I want to make sure you understand, do you have all of these distinctions? Because this is going to explode with the Nestorian controversy. If you don't understand this right now, Nestorianism is going to be a mess. You're really not going to be able to follow any of it. Okay? So are we good so far?
So far.
Let me just say I'll accept it now.
Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about the man himself. And we'll start this, I'm not sure, I'm probably not going to get too far, but we'll start. Next week, we'll really hammer out the whole controversy and show how all of this becomes one big muddled fruit salad. We know that Nestorius was the Patriarch of Constantinople. We know that he started out as a monk, and he was a pupil of our friend Theodore of Sustia. That's a critical point. Just think of Theodore. He was a student.
Teddy.
He was a student of Theodore, and he was a monk in Antioch. Now, just from that statement alone, what does it tell you?
Say that one more time.
He was a student of Theodore, and he was a monk in Antioch. So what does it tell you?
Distinct.
What did I just say about the Antiochian school?
Unity. No,
That's the other one.
Alexander was. Distinction, distinction, yes, distinction. Literal interpretation, distinction. Okay.
Yes.
Oh,
Okay. So he comes out of this context, all right? I write it down like this so that you can put notes underneath it, so you can just look. So anyway, so here is the school from which Nestorius was trained. So now when we talk about Nestorius and Nestorianism, that should be the mural through which you view everything that he does. It comes from that training, from that school. Who else was a member of this school? Let's go back, go back, go back.
Brother Arius?
oh, yeah.
Okay, so now do you see the challenge that we have? What happens as you move down the corridors of time? Now, Nestorius, to his credit, saw what happened with Arius. So what did he try to do? He tried to sharpen the problem with Arius, and we'll get to that. But I just want you to know, I just want you to see under what school he derives, because that's going to influence how he moves forward with his position. All right? Nestorius was consecrated to, well, not say consecrated. He was made the patriarch of Constantinople, not by an ecclesiastical council. It was Theodosius II that appointed him the patriarch of Constantinople. So now what do we have? Theodosius II, the emperor of Rome. Now what do we have? I'm not trying to be too cagey, pretty straightforward. Theodosius II appoints
It's all
Nestorius.
political.
Huh?
It's politics.
So now we have the merging of politics and religion in the early church. And we already saw this in Constantinople to a lesser degree. We saw it in Nicaea to a even more lesser degree. But politicians can't seem to keep their paws out of religion. Now, Constantine probably was the one who he probably had the best motives at heart. He wanted peace in the empire. He didn't want to be directly involved. He was kind of off in the wings going, please, please, please. Eusebius was going, okay, 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 I'll see what I can do. But he kind of stayed away. When we get to Theodosius I, we see a little bit more political involvement, and now we've got outright emperors appointing patriarchs. So within a short span, what, 100 years? 325 to 431? 100 years, 106 years? We've got what turns out to be a mess for the church for the rest of history. Didn't take long. So, Nestorius is now engaging, as the Patriarch of Constantinople, he's engaging theological issues, and somebody uses the phrase Theotokos around him. And he goes high and to the right. Okay? If you have no familiarity with experience, that means somebody goes nuts and starts shooting while they go, and boom, they go off. And he vehemently opposes that. His chaplain in Constantinople, his aide, is the guy that is his right-hand man, his chaplain, Anastasius, Anastasius, who was the supervisor, I don't know if he was an abbot, but he was the supervisor of the monks in Constantinople, openly forbade them from using that term. Would not allow them to use that term. He came up with, okay, this is the term that was eventually settled on, but Anastasius came up with this term. Anthropotokos.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay then.
Okay, what is anthropology?
Study of man.
What is tokos?
Bearer.
The man bearer. Okay. Also, this morphed into, I won't write it down, I'm not going to burden you with any more terms, but it also morphed into a term that was translated as the God bearer. So Mary bore God. All right, is that fixed in your minds? Because that's the issue right there. All right, so keep that in your mind. Nestorius now is besides himself. No, we're not going to do that. And this is where his system starts coming into play, because in order for him to reject Theotokos and develop Christotokos, the Christ bearer, he had to articulate his theology. And what school does he come from?
Antioch.
Thank you. And what is the emphasis of the Antiochian school?
Distinction.
Distinction. And therein lies the trauma of Nestorianism. Because that one phrase, distinction, marks his understanding of this and eventually allegedly informs his Christology. Most people today that look at all right, I'll say it. They look at the Presbyterian understanding of the Eucharist, right? And these are Lutherans that will bring this charge. But they look at the Presbyterian form of the Eucharist, where the Presbyterians say that in the Eucharist we have the real presence of Christ. We have the God-man, okay? However, the man, Jesus Christ, is seated at the right hand of the Father. Right? So far, so good. And Lutherans say, no, the God-man is ubiquitous. He is everywhere around the Lord's Supper. And the Reformed response to that is, that cannot be the omnipresence of the God-man cannot inhere in the Eucharist because omnipresence is what?
Everywhere, all at once.
No, I don't mean the definition. What is, well, to whom is omnipresence attributed?
God.
God.
And what then is omnipresence?
Divine.
Right.
We would, okay, if we were talking about the nature of God, we would say God is,
Eternal.
and just keep going with what,
Divine.
okay?
Omnipotent.
So you just said it, Nancy.
Divine.
No, you said it after that.
Attribute.
Attributes. Omnipresence is an attribute of divinity, right? So the Lutherans say because of the union, because of the union of the God man, his humanity can be omnipresent. And the Reformed say, no, no, no. If Jesus is vera homo, truly man, very man, he cannot be omnipresent.
So it's like a debate between whether attributes apply to, or inhere in natures versus in persons.
Yep. And what we call that in theology is the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of attributes. And the Lutherans identify the communication of attributes in such a way that the divine attributes, in this one instance, mind you, inhere in both the divine and the human. And the Reformed say that cannot be. And the Reformed say there is a, note the term, distinction between the human and the divine. Now here's the rub. When the Reformed use the term distinction, they are not including what the Antiochian school originally meant by that term. There's another D word that comes into play when you talk about the two natures, and what other word, when you talk about distinction, would come into play when you're talking about two natures? That creates a problem.
Division.
Division.
Oh.
So what the Reformed tell you is that no, there's a distinction, but not a division. We have the two natures, well, it's not up here, but we have the two natures, but we don't have this and we don't have this. So far, so good. Are you with me? So you see how 1,600 years ago, one word comes down to us, removed from its original context, and in our case it actually is better because we don't see distinction as division, but unfortunately they did. And that's what he's accused of. Now whether or not he actually believed that there was a division between the two natures, that's a real big can of worms. Because if you'll remember, I told you when we first started, what the originators of these alleged heresies or deficiencies taught may not be what their students passed on accurately. Okay?
You think?
So we look at, and I use the example of Zwingli and W.P. Stevens, who wrote this magnificent book on trying to resuscitate Zwingli's view of the sacraments. Now, I'd leave it up to the author, anybody that reads it, to determine whether or not he was successful in that. But the point that I'm making is that there is a case that people have made that the originator of the so-called issue did not actually adhere to what it now has become. And that's the same problem that we have with Nestorius. And when we get into talking about him and the system and all of this controversy in full, I will tell you about what was discovered in the 1900s that casts a pall on whether or not he actually believed in the division. We know he believed in the distinction, because I'm going to show you where he teaches it in just a second. But whether he believed they were divided, that's a different question. Because it's almost as if on the one hand he's saying distinction, and then on the other hand he's saying, no, we have divine and human. We have a unified person. So, an argument has been made. His students didn't understand what he was talking about. Remember what I said. Those at the beginning that originate new positions are dealing with issues that no one has dealt with before. Now, in the case of Nestorius, the issue of the two natures of Christ, yes, had been addressed, but it hadn't been resolved. We're in the 400s, and we're still dealing with Arianism, right? We're in 2026, and we still got them running around. They just call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses now. So when we sit there and they think, oh, the issue was settled, they're still dealing with it, and it's still fresh. And some putz keeps picking that scab. So everybody has to start commenting, which creates what we eventually have in Orthodox Christianity, and that is the reliance upon the decision of godly men in conciliar moments. Now, we recognize them not as infallible, because when we get to Councils 5, 6, and 7, you're going to see they're not infallible. But we've already seen distinctions. We've already seen challenges, and the challenges are going to become greater and greater and greater. And all I can say at this point is, I'm glad that I wasn't asked to teach a history of all of the councils, because I'd have a stroke by the time we got to the end of it. It is. I adore my brethren that go into medieval church history, because I have no idea how they do that. I'd be pulling my hair out of my head. But you see, I hope you're grasping this. You're building layer upon layer upon layer, and sometimes you can't get rid of these issues, and these issues crop up again, and somebody says, hey, I've got a redress to this. And the church goes, okay, well, let's see your redress. And they go, well, you missed this and you missed that. No, I'm right, and there you go. Now you got your fight. And that's what you got with Nestorius. And then when you get Cyril, and you throw Cyril in here, who we'll get into, I'll see if I can get to him in a minute. When you get Cyril in there, they started out as friends, and then boy, did that go south fast. Cyril became bitter and vindictive, and boy, did he go after Nestorius. He wrote a letter called the 12 Anathemas, to which Nestorius responded, the 12 anathemas refuted. So they had their thing going back and forth. But anyway, okay. So we see that Nestorius has a problem with the Theotokos. No. I need to make sure that there was a clear-cut distinction between the human and the divine natures, which he seemed, and this is the problem, this is where the problem comes in. Write the word person down. When we look at incarnation, and we read John 1, what we understand is the second person of the triune Godhead assumed a human nature such that we have a 100% divine nature and a 100% human nature united in what? Look down at the note that I just told you to write down.
And one person.
One person. That is the sum and substance of the nature of Christ. Nestorius seems, put that in quotes, seems to speak of Christ as two persons united. And therein lies the problem. He seems to speak that way. And he appears to deny any organic union between the man, Yeshua, and the divine Logos. Therein lies the sum and substance of the Nestorian Controversy, and it all arose from his response to that one term. Now, if you're interested at all, by the way, the letter he wrote to Cyril was called the 12 Counter Anathemas, reiterated. He said this, not one nature, but two are we constrained to concede to Christ. Now, on its surface, that we don't have a problem with that. Christ had a divine and human nature. Those are two natures. We don't have a problem with that. So now we have to analyze, what did his followers say? Were they accurate in their assessment of what their teacher was teaching? Did they really understand? Did Cyril truly understand what Nestorius was saying when he was arguing for a different reference? Because for him, let's follow the logic in his head. Let's separate out the two people. What happens? A woman giving birth. Well, you know what? Yeah, all right, I'll go with it. All right. So he looked at and he said, two natures and possibly two persons. But, and here's where the confusion comes in, Christ is not divided. Now that sounds orthodox. The Son of God is double in his natures. Now that may be a little sloppy phraseology, but there's no division yet. However, throughout the entire discussion of the Theotokos, he said the virgin born, let me rephrase that, the virgin bore, indeed, the Son of God, but, this is always a but, since the Son of God is twofold in his nature, what did she give birth to?
No, she didn't.
She gave birth to the manhood, which is the Son, because the Son is joined to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want you to pause for just a second, and you know, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop, because the next response is Cyril's broadside against Nestorius, and that's going to take the rest of an hour or so. But I want to repeat that so that you get this. Because this is where the problem with Nestorius arises. And then we have to ask, are we properly understanding what he's saying? Okay? Little Christian charity. He's dealing with Arianism still. Okay? That's still the bugaboo that's behind the scenes with all of this. And this will continue into Chalcedon, and it just continues. It's there. Christ is not divided. This is what Nestorius said. Christ is not divided. The Virgin bore indeed the Son of God. So far, so good. But since the Son of God is twofold, and here's where there might be the little crack in what he's saying. Might be. But since the Son of God is twofold in his nature, she bore the manhood, which is the Son, because of the Son who is joined to that manhood. So, tell me, what do you think? Is he a heretic? Is he not a heretic?
Sounds a lot like language in the Athanasian Creed.
Doesn't
to
it?
me. Yeah.
Doesn't it? Now here's where, from a scholar standpoint, here's where the rub comes in. Since the Son of God is twofold in his nature, is the Son of God twofold in his nature? Or is the incarnate Christ, does he have two natures? And if he has two natures, but he's one person, can Mary give birth to only one of the natures? What do you think? Is that possible?
No.
No. And this is where the confusion comes in, right at this point. Was he speaking inartfully? Now, I'm hoping you're grasping this, because I just showed you in the Eucharist with the Lutheran and the Reformed, I just showed you where this is still an issue today. So this is not pedantic material. This is important today. You talk to any evangelical, and outside of the fact that they wouldn't have a clue as to what you're saying when you're talking about this, but the import of this relationship between the God-man in communion is what? It's not even recognized. They don't know what that means. They don't have a clue. That's why it's an ordinance. That's why they do it once a quarter, whether you need it or not, and they provide the meaning subjectively.
Mere remembrance.
Oh, I remember. Dear Jesus, thank you. There's no objective, there's no objective reality to the gift that God has given us. Same with baptism. So all of this stuff from 1700 years ago sits in our laps today. And the only way that we're going to resolve this is to take people back here, and nobody wants to spend the time. Nobody wants to spend the time. And you can see why some people are like, I don't care, this is just over my head. And that's why I'm taking my time and going slowly over this so that you get this. You've got a man here that lost not only his position as a patriarch of one of the major sees, but was kicked out of the church. I think we owe him a fair reading. And quite honestly, and my training is in philosophy, so I get bent out of shape about language. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, was he just sloppy? Was this actually what he intended to say? Now, I can't get into the man's head. I can only go on what he wrote. But you see how dangerous language becomes in these issues. And we see that today in discussions. Ask any of your evangelical friends, what is the gospel? Good luck with that. Now, I'll give this to you and I'm going to close with this. In 1910, there was a discovery called the Bazaar, B-A-Z-A-A-R, of Heraclides, Heracleides. And it was in Syriac. And the discovery of that text turned the issue of Nestorianism on its head. Because scholars looked at that material and came to two entirely different conclusions. And I'll just give you two representatives, but you can look it up and you can further go down that rabbit hole if you'd like. The scholar J.F. Bethune-Baker, J.F. Bethune, B-E-T-H-U-N-E-Baker, said, no way, no how, Nestorian did not believe in what is today articulated as Nestorianism. Scholar F. Naw, N-A-U, said, a pox on both your houses, you're both heretics. No, he didn't say that. He just said, Nestorius deserved to be condemned. So you get two scholars, equal authority, equal education, looking at the same material, and they're saying, nah.
So nothing changes.
The argument is that the Bazaar is consistent in its rejection of the designation of the Mother of God, but does that in and of itself make Nestorius a Nestorian? While strongly asserting the full manhood of Christ as necessary for salvation. So Nestorius gets it. And what does that mean when it says it asserts the full manhood of Christ as necessary for salvation? He's advocating the incarnation. He's recognizing the full power of the incarnation. He's not separating and dividing anything. See? Gets a little naughty, not naughty.
Carol.
And Nestorius denied the Antiochian teaching that the union of the God-man was only a moral union. Who was he rejecting there? That was a little while ago. He's rejecting Sibelius. He's rejecting Apollinaris. He's rejecting the main representatives that come out of the Antiochian school. There are other issues, of course, when we're talking about Sabellianism and Apollinarianism, but it does link to that concept of a moral union, and he says no. He, Nestorius, said that the two natures are syntactic and voluntary. They are together and they have been by will united. I'll end with this. course, we know the result, he was excommunicated. But there were a number of Eastern bishops that continued to acknowledge that he was the primate, even after the Council of Ephesus. And they united to form what we know today as the Nestorian Church. And the Nestorian Church is generally characterized by a very vigorous missionary zeal. They were the ones that carried the gospel to India and Arabia. Unfortunately, in the 13th and 14th centuries, they suffered significantly at the Mongol invasions. And groups of Assyrian Christians survive to this day. And they consider themselves Nestorians and prohibit the use of the term Theotokos. All right, I'm going to stop. Next week, we will get into the full-blown argument and the whole mess and the politics and the sociology of it all, and we'll finish up, and then we'll get to Pelagianism the week after that, and then the Filioque after that.